In the United States in the mid-1800s, after the Civil War ended, slavery was abolished, and with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, African Americans were granted citizenship and voting rights. During the Reconstruction era, African Americans acquired more education. Academic institutions produced some of the most known scholars in our country, such as W.E.B. Du Bois. In 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois took a stand against Booker T. Washington by criticizing Booker's philosophy of acceptance of segregation and emphasis on material progress in Du Bois's book, The Souls of Black Folk, which was a collection of essays about the concepts of double consciousness and life behind the veil of race. Du Bois felt that political action would help lift African Americans to a higher social status, and it would get them better education and voting rights. Du Bois wanted African Americans to educate themselves so that they could become more important in society. After his critique of Washington, Du Bois started the Niagara Movement, which pushed for civil rights for African Americans, such as equal voting rights, the abolition of race distinction, and more. Eventually, the Niagara Movement formed into the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also known as the NAACP. The NAACP represented African Americans in court cases for civil rights, and they pushed for justice. W.E.B. Du Bois's activism for educational and equal rights lives on today. African Americans now have opportunities to achieve the highest level of education without limitation, and they have a higher social status and more rights. In the years 1861 through 1865, the Civil War was fought over the issue of slavery. As territories were becoming states, there was debate over whether they would come into the Union as a free state or a slave state. When Lincoln became president, many southern states seceded from the Union, eventually leading to the beginning of the war. At the end, the Union was victorious and slavery was abolished. Slaves became citizens and were granted voting rights, but they still faced discrimination and oppression. The arm of the federal government is long, but is far too short to protect the rights of individuals in the interior of distant states. Despite the abolishment of slavery, black codes and Jim Crow laws were set into place to limit the freedoms of African Americans. All that is necessary to be done is to make the government consistent within itself and render the rights of the states compatible with the sacred rights of human nature. During the Reconstruction era, the newly freed slaves didn't know what to do with their freedom. The white folks had all the courts, all the guns, all the hounds, all the railroads, all the telegraph wires, all the newspapers, all the money, and nearly all the land. And we had only our ignorance, our poverty, and our empty hands. The first school for freed peoples was established in North Carolina. Freed slaves were taught to read and write. As African Americans moved up in education, they were able to get jobs, but African Americans still faced difficulty with Jim Crow laws and black codes. If you can't read, it's going to be hard to realize dreams. Born in Virginia in the mid-1850s, Booker T. Washington spent his early childhood in slavery. Following emancipation, Washington felt that education was the best way to improve his living standards. Washington went to Hampton Institute, where he undertook industrial education. After Hampton, Washington went on to become an educator, and he founded the Tuskegee Normal and Agricultural Institute. As a Southerner himself, Washington was familiar with the needs of Southern blacks and the treatment that they received. Washington stressed that blacks should stop agitating for voting and civil rights, not only in exchange for economic gains and security, but also for reduced anti-black violence. Whites appreciated his efforts because they perceived them as a complete surrender to segregation and self-uplift. Born in Massachusetts in 1868, W.E.B. Du Bois grew up free in the North. He didn't experience the harsh conditions of slavery or Southern prejudice. He grew up in a predominantly white environment, attended Fisk University as an undergraduate, and later became the first African American to receive a doctorate from Harvard University. Du Bois believed in what he called the talented tenth of the black population, who through their intellectual accomplishments would rise up to lead the black masses. By the early 20th century, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois were the two most influential black men in our country. Washington believed that economic independence and the ability to show themselves as productive members of society would eventually lead blacks to true equality, and that they should for the time being set aside any demands for civil rights. Washington preached his philosophy of self-help, racial solidarity, and accommodation. He urged blacks to accept discrimination for the time being and concentrate on elevating themselves through hard work and material prosperity. This, he said, would win the respect of whites and lead to African Americans being fully accepted as citizens and integrated into society. Du Bois disagreed with Washington's strategy. Du Bois said that it would serve only to perpetuate white oppression. Mr. Washington's program practically accepts the alleged inferiority of the Negro races. Du Bois maintained that education and civil rights were the only way to equality, and that conceding their pursuit would simply serve to reinforce the notion of blacks as second-class citizens. Mr. Washington is especially to be criticized. His doctrine has tended to make whites, North and South, shift the burden of the Negro to the Negro's shoulders and stand aside as critical and rather pessimistic spectators, when in fact the burden belongs to the nation. Following a series of articles in which the two men expounded on their ideologies, their differences finally came to head when, in 1903, Du Bois published The Souls of Black Folks, in which he took a stand by directly criticizing Washington and his approach and went on to demand full civil rights for blacks. The black men have a duty to perform, a duty stern and delicate, a forward movement to oppose a part of the work of their greatest leader. W.E.B. Du Bois criticized Booker T. Washington because he wanted to educate blacks so that they could earn an important place in society by learning useful, specialized tasks. In 1905, W.E.B. Du Bois assembled a group of black civil rights advocates to demand full civil liberties for African Americans. The group provided vocal opposition to the philosophy of Booker T. Washington. The Niagara Movement is considered the first significant African American protest movement of the 20th century. The Niagara Movement was an institution dedicated to advancing the rights of black Americans. Wrong rules the land, and waiting justice sleeps. The Niagara Movement eventually dissolved, but in 1909, several of its members and many of its aims were incorporated into a new organization, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also known as the NAACP. For 25 years, Du Bois was director of publicity as well as the editor of its journal, The Crisis, which became the mouthpiece for the organization, for Du Bois, and for Black America. Negroes are men with the foibles and virtues of men. The NAACP was a crucial part of the civil rights movement and played an instrumental role in Brown versus the Board of Education. In 1954, with the NAACP arguing on behalf of the plaintiffs, the Supreme Court ruled in the case of Brown versus the Board of Education that the segregation of public facilities was unconstitutional. In the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. In 1955, the court ordered the desegregation of public schools, though it did not set a deadline for this process. 3 years after Brown, nearly all Southern schools remained segregated. The NAACP decided to push the federal government to enforce the 1955 Supreme Court order to desegregate public schools. When state governments in the South refused to cooperate with the implementation, the NAACP and other civil rights leaders organized nonviolent protests that set the stage for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the official end of racial segregation. Segregation in public education is not only unlawful, it is un-American. Also in 1955, after the arrest of the local NAACP secretary Rosa Parks for refusing to move to the back of the bus to accommodate a white passenger, the Montgomery NAACP organized a boycott of the city's buses. The year-long boycott called national attention to the South's Jim Crow practices and achieved the desegregation of Montgomery's public transportation. The Brown rulings, the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, and the questioning of racism in the country that proclaimed itself the world's leader of freedom and democracy attracted growing numbers of African Americans to the movement. Their magnitude and the movement's momentum gave them the courage to face the violent opposition of those who wished to maintain racial hierarchy. There would be no NAACP without W.E.B. Du Bois. Without Du Bois's activism for educational and equal rights, African Americans wouldn't have the rights and opportunities that they have today. W.E.B. Du Bois's stand against Booker T. Washington's belief of material prosperity and acceptance of discrimination truly led to the advancement of African Americans. Du Bois stood for education so that blacks could earn an important place in society. Now, African Americans have the opportunity to achieve the highest level of education without limitations, and they have a higher social status and more rights, all thanks to the passion and activism of W.E.B. Du Bois.